This is a series of short takes of steam locomotives on an 8mm amateur camera taken over a period of time from 1951 until 1965 in Louisiana and Texas. Here we have Southern Pacific train number 26, the local from Houston to Shreveport at Keithville, Louisiana in 1951. She's the largest of the Southern Pacific's Pacific type locomotives. And here we have the Southern Pacific's local number 217 leaving Shreveport in the spring of 1951. She's a 210-2, one of the F4 class engines. She's climbing the grade up through Union Station area to make a trip down to Lufkin, Texas. Here's the Kansas City Southern Belle with engine 810 coming in from Port Arthur. I'm sorry, it's the Flying Crow train, I should have said. The 810 was the last of the Pacific type locomotives built for the Kansas City Southern. This is Texas and Pacific Class D10 on a through freight train leaving Shreveport Hollywood Yard for New Orleans. If you'll watch closely, the engineer will blow the engine down on the right side as she leaves. There it goes. The engine number is 396, and now we catch her as she comes over Jewella Road crossing. Wave to the crew. And of course a real caboose on the rear end. And now we have the Louisiana Limited coming right dead for us, approaching Hollywood Yard in Shreveport. She's a gorgeous blue and white train. The Pacific type locomotive is a USRA Light Pacific, number 715. And again, we have her leaving Shreveport en route to Dallas, going over Hollywood Road crossing. And a solarium car brings up the rear. Beautiful travel in a beautiful era. Southern Pacific's first Pacific type locomotive, number 600, brings in train 26 at Jordan Street in Shreveport. And the Texas and Pacific's Louisiana Limited, leaving Shreveport through the IC crossing at Jordan Street. This is in September of 1951. Notice the blue tint to the oil smoke from the locomotive. And the Southern Pacific through freight train climbs the hill by Union Station. This is engine 905, one of the largest 210-2s on the TNNO. Kansas City Southern Flying Crow, engine 810, departs from Union Station. You can see the engineer is serious about his business. And she crosses Wilson's Alley, a very famous spot at the end of Union Station's yard tracks and throat. And here comes the Southern Pacific's westbound train from Shreveport to Houston, climbing Jordan Street Hill in Shreveport. And This was in the spring of 1952. Again, it is engine 600. Kansas City Southern 3-unit diesel locomotive being transferred from the LNA to the KCS shops, and deadheading with her is Kansas City Southern's Pacific Type engine 804, one of the first of the Pacific types, built in 1912. And the Texas and Pacific's Eagle running late, leaving Shreveport at the same time parallel to a freight train. This is at the west end of Hollywood Yard. And the Texas Zephyr on the Fort Worth and Denver, just west of Irving, Texas. And here's another day when the Texas Zephyr was handled by Fort Worth and Denver 554. Imagine a beautiful steam engine pulling a beautiful streamlined passenger train. This is the Katy's Mineola branch going to Greenville, taking at Alba, Texas, late in the fall of 1952. Very shortly after this movie was made, the rear two cars derailed. And this is a scene on the Norfolk and Western engine 605 on the Washington, D.C. to New Orleans passenger train, the Pelican. As we go forward, you will notice we go into a cut where there's a slide detector, and also you will see the position light signal change as the engine passes. The slide detector. Watch the signal. There it goes. That's Norfolk and Western's 405, a 480 used on a branch train out of Bristol, Virginia. And here comes the Southern Railway's Tennessean, because we are now on the Southern Railway's tracks south of Bristol. And this is the tunnel on the Illinois Central, leaving Vicksburg, and the bridge across the Mississippi River Bridge at Vicksburg, which, as you can see, is shared by the highway. And now we're in Fort Worth on the Fort Worth and Denver. Engine 455 is making ready for a day's work. She's going to switch out her train and leave for Childress and Wichita Falls. She's a large USRA Mikado. And a scene at the crossing at Carrollton, Texas, where the Cotton Belt and the Frisco meet. And here's a Frisco 4 units F unit train. Back in the days when diesels were pretty new to the railroads. And this is the local at Irving, Fort Worth and Denver engine 459. The engineer is oiling around in preparation for his run to Fort Worth. And that's A.E. Brown. He's going to make arrangements with the crew to make smoke for us just down the line. And you can see they made their smoke, but we changed our location. This was a better spot for pictures. Aha, the alert crew found us. This is a late day scene of the Texas Zephyr coming into Dallas. She's running a little late and she has a number of head-end cars. That's an E6, one of the early diesels in passenger service. And this is the Dirks Lumber Company number 360, formerly Schenectady, 1920. And the train is running between Mountain Pine, Arkansas and Jesseville. She was formerly DeQueen and Eastern 360 and was built as a passenger locomotive. And here we chase her along the highway. The steam exhaust at the tender is the tender tank heater exhaust. And now she's switching in the yard at Jesseville. She has a brand new coat of paint. Today the engine rests atop a rich mountain on exhibit. Was taken up there by the Army engineers. In Shreveport, 1957, the Fort Worth and Denver 454 visited us to work the high water territory. My daughter Virginia and my son David are enthralled by the sight of the steam locomotive. And little Sally wants to see what they're about. Not many kids today have been able to climb onto a working steam locomotive. The engine was used in high water between Shreveport and Alexandria during some floods. And here we have Calcasieu Paper number 9, a very small Baldwin locomotive built in 1912 for logging service, is now trying to switch the paper mill. She has entirely too many cars, and she tries 3 or 4 times to make the grade from the loading dock up to the interchange tracks. The fireman is trying to get up some additional steam pressure. And the exhaust at the rear of the tender is the tank heater going full blast to heat the oil before it is burned in the firebox. Well, let's make another try, fellas. My 8-year-old daughter, learning to be a rail fan, wants to know, when shall I click the shutter, Daddy? As you can see, the gallant little engine made many attempts to pull those great big cars up the grade. Finally, they broke the train in 2, and she was able to take it up in 2 cuts. Another picture, Daddy. You would think the oversized cab on that engine would be big enough. This was perhaps one of the last of the steam engines that we would see in regular service, at least so we thought. So we spent a lot of time with her. She sort of took our hearts. And here we have Dallas Union Terminal switch engine number 7. Although she was never a Southern Pacific engine, she was built to Southern Pacific plans. Painted and kept up in a beautiful style. You see her now about to turn a Missouri Pacific Solarium car on the Y that extended out from the Dallas Union Station tracks over the valley of the Trinity River. The engine now is a part of the museum at the Southwest Historical Society in Dallas. They used to turn the entire Sunbeam train on that trestle. And now we have Fisher Lumber Company number 7, originally Victoria Fisher in Western, and she was built about 1917. A little 262 wood burner. Steam leaks everywhere. She's on her last legs, or at least we so thought. Watch that drawbar. That's A.E. Brown climbing into the cab to get a ride with the crew. We join him. Now we're out shoving several L&A chip hopper cars out to the interchange with the KCS. About 3 loads was her capacity. And we have to stop and wood up again. She had a tremendous appetite for wood. You can see the water was bad by all of the foam and so forth around the steam dome and from the steam leaks. But here comes another load of 3 cars. You had to get there early in the morning, for the crew went to work at 6:30, and by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning they were all done for the day. You can see the piston packing leaking on both the cylinders and on the air pump. Notice there is no coupling on the rear of the tender. This engine performed all its work from the head end. The number 7 on her tender was painted by a Seagram's 7-crown salesman. And again, she was one of the last steam engines still in service in the western Louisiana territories in the early 1960s. This is Angelina County Lumber Company number 110 at the paper mill at Hurdy's, Texas. Occasionally she was called to switch the mill when the diesel had to go in for repairs. It's raining, so it was difficult to get a good picture of her. Joe Carlson and I made a recording of a 45-mile trip with this locomotive back in 1959, so it was a thrill to see her still operating in 1961. They kept the engine in beautiful shape. And here's Angelina County and Neches River Alco diesel number 11 on the through freight train. A wooden caboose and an official highball. And this is the Katy 559 coming through Point, Texas late in the evening with that gorgeous yellow caboose into the sunset. And now we skip to 1964, where the Burlington sent engine 5632, one of their largest and most recently built 484s, to Kansas City for fan trip specials. Isn't it beautiful to see her painted in a gold coloring with the Burlington emblem? This was perhaps the only time that a prototype locomotive ran around in gold coloring, notwithstanding that modelers can do that every day with their beautiful brass locomotives. Here she's preparing for a fan trip early one morning to go to St. Joseph and back. And we're at Murray Yards in North Kansas City. And this is in the fall of October 1964. We were interrupted by a jet airplane from the airbase. Now we're out between Farley and Beverly to see how well she runs. I think we fell in love right about here. And now we chase the engine. The speedometer is up at 70 miles an hour on our car. And remember, this is on jointed rail before things were improved as they are today. It's pretty hard to hold a camera and drive a car too. And now we take off to leave the engine in order to get ahead to get a shot as she comes by. We just about didn't make it, as you can see. And this is at Beverly, Missouri, right across from Leavenworth. Now we're in slow motion, actually. And here's a view of Union Station on their 50th anniversary celebration. You can see a Union Pacific big boy, now based in the Dallas Museum, has visited the station, along with the Rock Island Diesel, Kansas City Southern baggage cars, and officers' cars. The 4018 was a mighty sight to see in Union Station. How we wish all of that could be reenacted again today. And we're back at Beverly again, for the 5632 is coming home. And incidentally, these views were taken by my 9-year-old son David. Again, she's strutting her stuff. That's me after a still view of the train. And now we're going to ride another fan trip that they had in October '64. From Kansas City to Bevier, Missouri, and return. This is a view when we're starting out from Murray Yard in Kansas City. Even the helicopter is interested in our trip. For a short distance, we travel along the Missouri River. There's a gondola at the rear of our consist, which is 12 cars total. No seats in the gondola, it was standing room only, but how much we enjoyed that, as you will see. And now she's backing up for a run-by, which was somewheres near Chillicothe. Here she comes. if you can have a love affair with a golden engine. We certainly did. And now she's at Brookfield, where they changed crews. And a run by at Buckland, Missouri. That's the Santa Fe Bridge that she's going under. Again, we have the camera in slow motion. And a view from the rear of the gondola of how the track and the scenery looked in North Missouri between Brookfield and Bevere in October 1964. There were many happy fans that day, and space on the gondola car was very much at a premium. We're getting close to the west switch at Bevere. In those days, there was no CTC. You had to throw the switch by hand, and trains were operated by timetable and train order. Yes, he took the slack out of the train. And these are a few scenes around Bevere. But it was almost impossible to get a picture of the engine without a lot of people around. Certainly that's very understandable. The engine was turned, but the train consist remained the same. Therefore, the gondola car was now right behind the tender on the engine. The engineer was very proud and happy to be able to run a steam locomotive once again. Soon it will be time to start west. However, the trainmaster told us that we would meet a freight train here at Bevere before we left. So we stayed on the ground and got a few more pictures of the engine as she moved backwards to get into position to leave town. Much to our surprise, after the American Royal passenger train passed, he started out. So we said, if they're going, we'll go too. So we got on the gondola right behind the engine, wondering all the time, where's that freight train that's coming against us? No one seemed to be afraid. We passed the station at Callow. We crossed the bridge before entering Buckland. About here, the engineer blew 2 longs and a short, and I was able to rest easy, for I knew then that the meet point had been changed to Buckland. That's my daughter, 13-year-old Ginger, having a wonderful time. Some of you will recognize Joe McMillan, who has a wonderful career on the Santa Fe. He and I made acquaintance on this train and decided to photograph each other. Here comes the freight train after a 45-minute delay. And the crew gives us a friendly wave. And now we leave the west switch of Buckland. What a beautiful trip and what a beautiful day that was. Later on, between Brookfield and Cameron Junction, we clocked the engine at 82 miles an hour while we were standing in the gondola car right behind the tender. That was a real thrill. All the townsfolk as well turned out. And of course my children have to see whether or not they can balance on a rail. The safety valve lifts. The fireman didn't put any water in the engine, so the engine foreman had to run up there and show him how to turn on the injector. And my son David, 11 years old, enjoying life with a steam engine. And here we have the Flying Scotsman from the London Northeastern Railway, number 4472, visited Kansas City during her tour of America. If I recall, this was in 1966. She had a gorgeous rear-end observation car. Wouldn't you love to ride in a car like that on America's railroads today? That car is named India. A beautiful train. The British loading gauge, however, is smaller than the American loading gauge, so all of their equipment looks a little bit tinier than ours. Their water car was made to match the tender. You will notice that British locomotives have more spokes per driver than American locomotives do. That's why the wheels look more spidery, if I may coin a phrase. The headlight and the bell and the classification lights were added to comply with American railroading, and of course so was the drawbar, so that the Kansas City terminal switch engine could handle her to Chicago Junction and turn the train around. This is at the west end of Kansas City Union Station. And here we have a Rock Island freight train at Burlington, Colorado. Oh yes, the Rock Island ran a mighty fine line back in their time. The grain elevators were the lifeblood of many railroads. David wants to see what happened to his pennies and his quarters. He's gotten a little older now, so he likes to ham it up. And here we have nickel plate 759 on the Golden Spike Special, arriving Birmingham, Missouri, or I should say passing through Birmingham en route to Kansas City. It's quite late in the day, as you can see. The humidity is such that you can see the water level inside the tender by looking at the outside of the tender. Here she is the next day at North Kansas City at the Norfolk and Western's roundhouse facilities. A tender full of coal. She laid over here about a week before she was able to return with the special back east. We were so happy to have a steam locomotive appear in Kansas City. And this, of course, was in May of 1969. And we're making a little trip east That's an I-70 bridge over the Gasconade River in Missouri, of course. This is a pastoral scene of the Winchester and Western between Gore, Virginia and Winchester, Virginia. The locomotive is a very early EMD switcher, formerly from the Baltimore and Ohio. And now we have Reeder engine 1702. She's a war baby built by Baldwin in 1943 for the U.S. Army, later used on the Warren and Saline River, and finally on the Reeder Railroad while she was in regular service. The 1702 is the Army's number for the engine, which was preserved throughout. She ran some wonderful excursion trains from Reeder to Waterloo, Arkansas, and returned under the guidance of Tom Long, president of the Reeder Railroad. These pictures were taken in May of 1972. We've ridden the cab of that engine, and while she was on the Warren and Saline River, she had a whistle from a Cotton Belt 800 that was absolutely out of this world. Today she has only one tank car for Waterloo, which is a sign of the times of what was happening to the business of the line. However, there were 4 carloads of happy passengers, and here we see them arriving at Dill's Mills. I just wish you could hear that whistle blow. Several of those cars, although they were originally from Pullman, operated on the Kansas City Southern. And now we're leaving Dill's Mills. It was indeed a flag stop. The first car in the consist was a Milwaukee Road combination car. David is getting near 18th birthday. Now we have Black Hills Central 103, formerly Peninsula Terminal 103 of Portland, Oregon. The Black Hills Central train ran from Custer, South Dakota to Hill City, South Dakota. This little tank engine did a yeoman job of road work, not at all what she was built for. And here she is climbing a grade several miles east of and north of Custer, South Dakota. She's backing up, unfortunately, but she's making a good clip, for we have the camera in slow motion. And here she crosses a rather deep but short trestle. She's pulling 7 cars of very happy passengers. She's getting closer to Hill City now as we followed her along her route. We tried to chase her in the car, but she was almost too fast for us. And here we have some early dawn shots at the west end of Emporia on the Santa Fe. We weren't at all sure that the Kodachrome film would come out. Now we give you a view of steam power on the New York Central. These are selections from official New York Central films, and they were produced by Richard M. Dahl in 1961. Most of the views, however, were either made in 1940 or 1946. So it will show you the New York Central along the Hudson River in the Mohawk Valley as it was when nearly all steam prevailed on the rails. While the bulk of the power is Hudson's, it starts out with the little DeWitt Clinton, their very first locomotive and train on the Albany and Schenectady Railroad of 1831. This scene was actually made in 1948 at the Chicago Railroad Fair. This gives you an idea of how our railroads were born, the very carriages they used for passenger cars. And here we have a view of the famous 999 of the Empire State Express, the locomotive that officially made 112.5 miles an hour back in 1896. Or perhaps it was 1893. That was some speed for its era. You can see here that she is making preparations for her run. Edward Hungerford, if I recall correctly, put on this stage show. It was the most famous railroad stage show ever done, and here comes the 999 on her famous run. And now we have the famous Hudson type locomotive, the perfection passenger steam locomotive built by the New York Central, originally in 1927. The four-wheel trailing truck was designed so she could have a larger firebox and thus greater steaming capacity, and could haul heavy passenger trains at higher speeds than a Pacific-type locomotive could do. The New York Central owned more Hudson types than any other railroad in the country, some 200 or 250 of them. And they perform yeoman service. Here we see the 5238, one of the first series of the Hudsons. They're turning the engine at the Harmon Roundhouse, which was just out of New York City, where the steam was turned over to electric operation into New York City to avoid pollution of the city. I believe this is the 5204, one of the very earliest of locomotives of the Hudson type. No, it's the 5314. The hostler at a roundhouse in those days had a very important duty, and it was quite difficult to move locomotives around and be sure everything and everybody was in the clear. And even though the coal towers were very well mechanized, you can see there was a lot of handwork involved just the same. Hundreds of locomotives would take their coal from that tower each day. The 5281 was originally one of the big four Hudson type locomotives. Again, all on the same general pattern, but each series was improved as they went along. Coal and water, two very important ingredients for the operation of a steam locomotive. 14,000 gallons was a pretty good size for the tender. And yet that wouldn't last for a whole trip. You still had to take water along the way. The alligator crosshead. Baker valve gear. And of course a booster on the trailer truck to aid in starting and climbing heavy grades. And now we see some mainline operation. These views were taken around Harmon, New York, where the electric trains were changed over to steam locomotives. Position light color interlocking signals, and the tunnel at Oscawana, New York. This is a fireman's eye view. Can't see much in front of that engine. And the engineer's eye view. And again, we're going north up the Hudson River. This is a station above Peekskill. The train, although I'm not sure of its designation, should be the Empire State Limited. Later it was specially streamlined. Other trains that we will see in this film are the Mohawk, the North Shore Limited, the Knickerbocker, the Ohio State Limited, the Henry Hudson, the North Shore Limited, and the Laurentian. And that's up by Bear Mountain on the Hudson River. Bear Mountain on the left or west side of the river. And this train is southbound. And here's one. Actually, the New York Central ran east and west, so this is a westbound train. There was much head-end traffic in those days. And here you see the Empire State Express. And here's the train taking water on the fly. One of the 5400 series Hudsons, streamlined. And in the snow, what a beautiful pastoral scene. And this is one of the earlier Mohawk type locomotives used extensively in freight service. Mohawk was the designation the New York Central used for the mountain type. And another streamlined Hudson. And here a freight train is crossing over to the center track, which was generally reserved for passenger trains of high speed. And now we have a view of the lowly switch engine, the 060. And yet that little switch engine did the yeoman amount of work for the railroads in the days, for if trains weren't made up, they couldn't run. A view of an outside braced boxcar, a hump yard, and these were at Selkirk, New York. The New York Central used a lot of 080 type engines for switching service as well. But here we have a little 060 making up a passenger train. And a very early diesel, contrasted with a Mohawk type. Those particular upper quadrant signals with the distance signal on the bottom arm were particular to the New York Central. And here we have a stock train. Many, many trains of live cattle were taken into New York in the early days for slaughter. And another mountain type engine called a Mohawk. You will notice that the stock cars were always on the head end of the train so that the slack action would be minimized and not throw the cattle around in the cars and perhaps break their legs. Here we have two freight trains, the lifeblood of the railroad. Well, no, a mail train. One of the later day Mohawks. And here a Hudson on a fruit train, vegetable train from California. This one looks like just a general local train. And one of the early day Mohawks again, coming through into Selkirk Yard. And the streamlined Hudson. This is on the Putnam Division at Elmsford. The 10-wheelers were built about 1910 to 1912, and they were the early day passenger engine. Now they're relegated to the Putnam Division to handle a commuter service. It was one of my early day experiences on these locomotives back in 1936 and 37. You will see the distance signal. That signal would portray either yellow or green. And again, one of the Mohawk type locomotives on a freight train. Now these scenes were probably made about 1946, for here we will see a Niagara, which was their name for the 484 type locomotive. I believe this was taken close to Albany. The smoke deflectors, often referred to as elephant ears, were very distinctive on these locomotives. And the station at Hyde Park, New York, which was used to portray Yonkers in the movie Hello, Dolly. while I'm not sure of the train, I believe that was another one of the Empire State Express or the Laurentian. You can see it has a special observation car. Yes, steam locomotives did exactly that. And while we didn't complain that much of pollution in those days, most of this is steam. And the hostler is putting the engine away at the end of the run. Of course, it will be cleaned and supplied and made ready for the next outgoing trip. There you get a good look at the operation of the Baker valve gear. Operation at the turntable was a place where you had to be very careful of what you were doing. Aha, she slips her drivers trying to get into the stall, just like any horse ready to go to the barn. Easing her into the stall where minor repairs could be made before she was called to go on her next run. I hope you enjoyed the New York Central film. They certainly had every right to be very proud of their Hudson-type locomotives. Now we give you a few more shorts. This is the Olin Matheson 262 switch engine at the paper mill at West Monroe, Louisiana. Again, an engine that ran up into the mid and 1960s, still handling pulpwood for the paper mill. And this is Mississippian engine number 76, formerly Jonesboro, Lake City and Eastern, and later Frisco engine. The engine, of course, as you know, has been preserved, but this is when she was in regular service on the Mississippian Railway. And of course, my daughter and son, who you've already met, enjoy any chance they got to follow Daddy's hobby and climb into a steam locomotive. Here we have the Oneida Western, a 280, switching the coal docks at Kellerman, Alabama. We couldn't get close to her because the ground was too swampy. Again, she was one of the late operating steam locomotives, hand-me-downs from other railroads. And then we have a short session of the operating HO layout of the Virginia Central Railroad in our house in Shreveport in 1964. This was just before we had to saw the railroad up and move to Kansas City. You can see there a Southern Railway PS4 on a passenger train. We had a double-track main line from the terminal out to the midpoint, and then two single tracks radiating back to the terminal so that you could make an alternate route and actually run around the layout 5 times without repeating trackage. Here comes Sierra number 38. A little 2662, and there's a Texas and Pacific 210-4 on a vegetable block train. Aha, there's the man at the controls. David was but 9 years old. He'd fallen out of a tree and broken his arm. But he's staging quite a wonderful meet between these two opposing trains. Let's look at it again. Ah yes, and all that while the Southern PS4 is handling the passenger train. We never got to the point of installing scenery on the layout before it had to be torn up. And there's a Rio Grande 3600. She was pretty big to try to operate on that layout, even though we tried to keep the curves about 28 to 36 inch radius. She's on the lower level line that was intended to follow the river bank on one side, the double track on the other side. But here she comes, making those sharp curves. Aha, the little work train is trying to climb the branch line grade up the trestle. Looks like the engineer's overloaded. The passenger train is making another run, while the Rio Grande Malley waits in the clear. And now the passenger train's gone, so she can take out, cross over, and go down the inbound main line. Unfortunately, the first car behind the engine derailed. And this is our roundhouse. For some reason it didn't come out the first time, so we always try again. We never quit. Southern Pacific Class E24440. Aha, the passenger train is finally making it into the depot. And here comes the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern 10-wheeler. The early day engine to run the Empire State Express and the 20th Century Limited across the Lakeshore. And here she's pulling open-end coaches from Ambroid. Naturally, there's head-end traffic. And now we have the Southern Belle, but today she's being pulled by a mountain-type locomotive, which is a Bowser, one of the very early locomotives in HO gauge, built after the Knapp 482. The cars are blue line, equipped with lights and interiors. They were used on the Louisiana State Fair exhibit for the Kansas City Southern. She's hurrying very fast about her appointed rounds. And mind you, all of these are in control of David. He's going now with the wrecker to get up, pick up that derailed car behind the Malley